Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for my 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. Since the last project update video, the very last of the tank's details have been painted and mounted in place. In this video, we're going to be going over the additions as well as the features that brought the model up to the condition that we have here, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Picking up this video exactly where the last one left off brings us back to the turret. In the other video, I mentioned how the turret was finalized, where the bodywork was done to the cast texturing, the welds were done, and also the top details as well as the other details were fleshed out. Well, at this point now, the turret has been coated with its coat of final prime. The primer that I'm using is standard El Cheapo flat black spray paint, just like I used on the hull in a couple of videos previously. The reason why I went ahead and painted it at this point without the hatches fitted in place is because on the front trunnion section, this does need to get a little shot of the base coat in order to me to permanently install the armament, because once that's fit in place, you're not going to be able to get into these recesses over here very easily. And this is one of those things where, and this is same is true for the little ones too, by the way, where you'll paint it, but paint won't get into certain recesses, and there, without fail, there will be this point where you elevate the mantlet, and you're going to have bare exposed material shown, and that is something that just kills the look of the build. That's why I always go ahead and I paint everything in the format that we have here. There's optic, the loader's hatch area, not so much for the commander's cupola. Currently that is getting painted off camera with its interior, and we'll be circling back to that as the video progresses. However, on the turret itself, you really get to appreciate now all of those details in a single color. You see the weld beads right there, how they just come out nice and crisp, as well as all the other details that, again, were referenced in the previous video. The other thing that I also want to reference at this time is, as I mentioned before, the turret itself is a mosaic of materials comprised of a large casting for the main turret itself, but then rolled steel for the top plate. And in the other video, I went ahead and referenced how exactly do I achieve that with the process of the texturing, and you can see that now that the thing is fully painted, you get to appreciate a clear delineation between what's cast and what would be rolled plate. This alone gives the model a ton of added accuracy as well as detail fidelity. Alright, so nothing much to go over here. I'm going to go ahead and throw some OD into the airbrush and have added to the certain locations. Hopping forward to the next step, you get to see what the various areas look like with the application of the base coat as well as with the weathering. Both of these were applied with the airbrush, and they were obviously done in a strategic manner. This was not only done to the mantlet area, the optic, and the loader's hatch section, but I also went ahead and applied it to something else that is very easily overlooked, specifically on these later pattern of Sherman turrets, which is the overhanging blower. Obviously, this is open on the inside over here, and this is something that's very easily overlooked, specifically when you're going through the motions of the build. In addition to that, I also went ahead and added the base coat to the rim here of the turret. Again, these areas here are commonly overlooked. With this now all taken care of, I can go ahead and punch out the mass and go ahead and drop the mantlet and the barrel assembly into the appropriate location, now permanently. As you can see, the mantlet has now been permanently attached to the turret via the springs and the pins that I was referencing before. And like I mentioned in the other video, this is just half of the equation. The last piece that needs to be added to this area to seal it up are the external cap faces. On the real Jumbo, or by extension the T23, because again it's the same mantlet system, there would be two large lugs that would be fastened to these areas here and welded in place, and these units would be the pivot points for the mantlet and the inner armament section to pivot on. And these sections do have a distinctive look to them that these little pins here just don't mimic. So what I went ahead and did was, off camera, I went ahead and fabricated the detail faces, and you can see them right here. These units here are fabricated out of just some sheet styrene that were cut to the shape of the disc, and then I went ahead and added the divot in the middle. Fortunately, again, I didn't get it on camera, but the way I did this was with the use of a hole saw. So on this hole saw set that I mentioned in a previous video, I went ahead and took this unit over here And I utilize this system because this is the only way to really cut a perfect circle. If anyone has ever tried to cut a perfect circle before, you'll know what I'm talking about. So, as a life hack, it's a really easy way to do this when you have a hole saw setup. However, you may be looking at this and saying, but John, how are you able to drill out the disc here without this large drill bit drilling through the plastic? And well, there's the life hack. You see, these units here all have a removable pilot screw. This one here has a small little Allen wrench. Some have a slot screw, but somewhere along the lines there's a fastener present. What I did was, with my Allen wrench, I went ahead and loosened this fella up. The bit slides out. Then once that bit is removed, you can then go ahead and remove the bit just like so. Once the bit is removed, you then go ahead and reassemble the hole saw as you would normally. And now you have the ability of drilling out a perfectly round disc without the large hole for the pilot drill. And I can see some people saying, but John, you need this bit over here in order to center the piece. And the answer is not necessarily. If you have a steady enough hand, you can actually drill this out by hand, or, like I use, the drill press, which is a fantastic way on keeping everything nice and squared. And with the drill press, it just naturally drills the piece out, and there's no wobbling or any drifting of the bit. This is granted that you are really clamped down pretty good with the material, and if you do that, you should be able to drill through without any sort of problems. This is only plastic, so it cuts through in no time. Then after the disc was drilled out, it gave me this nice little perfect piece that we have here. But now I need to drill the center divot. And again, this is something that you kind of need to have tools for, because trying to do this by hand is a bit hit and miss. You can't do so. The trick is you just go ahead and draw a bunch of cross lines, and when they all intersect, you now have your center divot. But it's still something that could be tricky, and you could potentially have the risk of running slightly off center. In order to do this, well, I took the disc, I threw it into the lathe, and with the lathe chuck grabbing the piece and spinning, I was able to then take the tailstock and add the divot here with a drill bit. Once the drill bit was drilled in, or I should say once the divot was drilled in, I went ahead, loosened everything up, removed the piece from the chuck, and now I have the perfect setup that you see here. The disc is a perfect circle, and the divot is perfectly centered, and is also the exact same depth amongst the two. After this was accomplished, the unit was pre-primed, as you can see, and are now ready for installation. But before I do want to put this thing back together, because these are the type of things where if you leave it in pieces, parts tend to get lost. Like I almost did just here with the securing fastener. So, Alright, now with that unneeded bit of footage recorded, I could put everything back away and continue with the installation of the disc. But still, it's a good technique to have and want to really help you in your toolbox if you are doing specifically scratch builds like this. Anyway, the other thing to mention about the disc was something that I mentioned in the previous video, was with the countersunk added for the pinhead. When I first drilled the parts out, the pinhead sat flat onto the trunnion section, but obviously that's going to be an issue for this piece to sit flush. So in the previous video, with a Dremel with a high-speed removal bit, I went ahead and removed the material in this section over here, so that now when the pins are fitted, as you can see, they're not just flush, but slightly below the surface, which is exactly what you want. Okay, from here, I'm just going to go ahead and install these. This little drop of super glue is really all that's necessary. And I just got to carefully line it up. Hopefully I can do this while on camera. Once the piece is properly indexed and the glue set, you're all done. As you can see, this portion of the turret is completed, and it definitely looks true to form to the real one. It's also at this time you can see why I went ahead and pre-primed this section over here with the flat black, because now I could just go ahead and when I'm going through the paintwork, just throw a little bit of OD in this spot over here, and it's going to be more than suffice for taking care of the paintwork in this spot. As I mentioned in the last video, one of the last bits of detailing that were going to be needed to be added to the tank to get it finished was the internal portions of the periscopes. The outer portions of the periscopes I covered in an earlier video, and you can see one of the clear printed units right over here, or translucent printed units, better way to put it. However, this is just half the equation. Obviously, this is for the exterior portion of the model. However, for the longest period of time, one of the pieces that had been eluding me was the internal portions of the US AFE periscopes. For the longest time, I didn't have to design these components over here because there was a fantastic set available in cast resin from the company Panzerwerk. The Panzerwerk parts were absolutely perfection, so the need to go ahead and tool up my own was just not necessary because, frankly, there's so many other things I need to tool up, and his were perfect from the get-go, no point to reinvent the wheel. Well, that was the status quo for the longest period of time. However, about 10 or 12 years at this point now, Panzerwerk folded up shop and are no longer in the business, and sadly that left quite a gaping hole in the market. Now, for their Sherman parts, the ones that I personally loved and used to use the most, I went ahead and picked up the slack and filled in a good portion of the parts that were left blank when he left, and one of the bigger components were the ones here on the table. I cannot stress enough just how much I was procrastinating on wanting to design these pieces here because they're quite intricate with their detailing, and there are a lot of other things I do want to get to. However, these are one of those things I kind of have to eat my vegetables on, but I'm glad I did because these units here are absolutely perfect, and I'm glad that I got to them later than sooner because with the advancements with my techniques and CAD work as well as with the material choices that I'm using, these pieces here are probably the best they're going to get. So it's probably, again, better that I procrastinated for the longest period of time. Anyway, at some point between the videos, I went ahead and said, all right, sucked it up, let's do this. I sat in front of my computer at 2 a.m. in the morning, which is when I generally do CAD, and this here is the outcome. So let's go ahead and see exactly what I cobbled together. What you see here on the table is a mix of parts that are going to be included with the ECA internal periscope set, as well as also parts that are going to be included with the cast resin late production or the later pattern single hatch panoramic cupola. When you purchase these sets, they are not going to contain this guy over here. This guy over here is purely for the cupola and will be supplied with that set. So that set's going to get a little bit of an update where I'm going to be supplying this piece over here. But we'll go ahead and circle back to that in a moment. The ECA set contains 3 of these components. You have 3 of the bases and 3 of the periscope inserts. But you'll also see a component over here that's made in translucent. And if anyone has been following my other components that are similar to this, you'll probably see exactly what I'm doing over here. Starting with the base itself, and by the way, pay no attention to my dirty hands and fingernails. I literally just came from painting a bunch of models in the shop, and this is why I generally wear rubber gloves when I'm doing the model showcase videos. But for these videos over here, it's not as important. Anyway, so you can see the base now brought up close to the camera. Hopefully it focuses in. And the piece is completely fully detailed. So let's see if I can get this thing. There you go. So the first thing I want to point out is that the plate is a 2-piece affair on the real unit. And you can see that the slit line over here is off center, just like it is on the real unit. And you can see the countersunk slot screw fasteners right there present on the top and bottom. The housing for the periscope itself is also integrally printed on as a single unit, so no sanding or other types of modifications needed to make to the bottom in order to square it off. That's already done for you. And the piece is fully detailed with the drum section as well as with the main base section. The reason why we have this drum section over here is because the real periscope can actually pivot and has some yaw to it. That's not a feature found on the model one here. Yes, I know I'm a slacker, but the piece is still there with its detailing either way. The remainder of the frame is, again, as fully detailed as humanly possible, where we have these 3 little perforations here on the rigidity straps. The rigidity strap on this side is actually a piece of metal that's bent and folded over, as you can see. Then it would be spot welded in place. The spot weld details are, by the way, there, and to give it just a little bit of human touch, they're not exactly perfect with the layout, so they're not evenly spaced. There's just a slight little deviation on them, and if anyone's ever seen anything that's been spot welded, you'll know what I'm talking about. Same is also true for the one here on this side. See the spot welds present on everything. Again, this is really going to come out nicely once the panel line accent goes in here, but that remains to be seen. We also have the locking mechanism right over here. This little knob is what tightens down on the housing and keeps it in place, and it locks it and prevents it from pivoting either forward or backward. On that note, you can see the other locking tab right over here, this little knob. This knob would be used to rotate this thing, because in addition for the periscope itself being able to pivot, the entire housing can actually rotate. If anyone saw the movie Fury, you'll know what I'm talking about. On the front portion over here, or I guess this would be the back portion, you get to see the headrest. The headrest is integrally printed on. I was thinking about perhaps making this as a separate 3D printed part using a cast rubber piece, but I figured, nah, I could go ahead and just integrally print it and just paint it with a paintbrush. Yeah, I'm getting lazy, what can I say? But either way, the piece is fully detailed, where it has the housing, as you can see right there. It's got the mounting fasteners for the rubber pad section, which would have a metal backing to it, and the piece is hollow. As you can see, again, it's like folded. It's just a folded piece of stamped sheet metal on the real one, and those details transferred over onto this. Again, stuff like this, it's impossible to achieve in basically any other medium. These holes here, by the way, are also punched through and through, just like the real unit. And on the rear portion over here, we have this slot cut into this piece, and you'll see why that slot's there in a moment. And we have this little locking mechanism, which on the real unit, you would slide in place, and kind of works like the lock on a door. And once this piece slides in place, it prevents the periscope insert from sliding out. That's all there is to that. And this brings us to the periscope. So the periscope is comprised of two components. We have here the main housing, and we have here the lens. Let's start with the housing. So the housing, once it gets in focus over here, is fully detailed, and you can see on the front portion here we have this, what appears to be a spring clip, and this is used to give a little bit of tension to the periscope, and it prevents it from just sliding out really easily. On the reverse side here, we have the locking knob right over there, and note the shape of that. And we have this little alignment tab that's also found on this section. On the sides, we have a data plate right there in the middle, as well as also these little, I guess these would be like locking tabs, best way to put it. I believe you can actually take this thing, the housing off of the prism that's on the inside. But either way, those details are there, and they are fully detailed as much as humanly possible. Note the geometry of the piece sunk in, as well as the curved edges to the inner portion and the outer portion, again, just like the real unit. And on the opposite side right here, we still have those little locking tabs, but the data plate is not present on this side. Again, true to form to the real one. On the bottom portion, you can see the little, I believe these are spot, if they're not spot welds, I believe they are sunken fasteners. It's one or the other, but either way, these perforations are there on the real unit, so they transferred over to the ECA one. And this brings us to the prism. So the lens itself is a translucent material, just like on the other prisms that are produced. The idea is that you paint around the unit over here, and this gives you some excellent detail fidelity and accuracy compared to just the opaque way and just paint the lens flat black or whatever, or I'm sorry, gloss black or whatever color that you deem fit. Some people like blue. Silver's the worst. Gloss black on my tank models is the go-to, and that's the one thing I always reference. But on this one here, you don't even have to do it because the piece is just going to have the natural color. So we can see the translucent material now in focus right there. You can see the lens section is sunk in from the housing, and the housing actually has a cover on it as well. You can see the little cover is fastened in place with these little fasteners right here. We have this little handle right there. It's also integrally printed on. And note the geometry of the piece. The side sections are sunk in, and they do have these other tiny little recesses and divots present on these sections here. Again, I tried to make these things as detailed as humanly possible, and basically, this is the nearly perfect periscope. There's no point for me to ever go ahead to replace this. If I'm going to have the piece, if I'm going to work hard on it, it's going to be one that's going to be kind of future-proof, and I think that's what I accomplished here. The idea is that you can see the two printed in holes found on the prism. The idea is that when the time comes, you could just glue it to the housing itself and the piece will fit in. Now, with the way the piece is printed with the tolerances and materials that they are, it seems that the piece is a little bit snug. However, it's easy to just slightly widen these here with the Dremel, and once that's done, the piece will just lock in place. But you get an idea. Also, on how this piece fits in place, I was very careful with the tolerances on this piece here, so this should slide in a bit easier. The way this is done is that, remember, the prism would be found in this section over here, and this guy here, when the time comes, just slides into place, like so, and voila, the piece is now fully seated. With the lens present, it's going to look something like this. And we will see as the video goes on how that pans out. Some people are wondering, John, couldn't you just have molded or integrally printed the housing into the piece here? And I was thinking of that, actually. That would have cut down on the parts count. However, for two reasons why I did it. One, it allows you better detail fidelity on the piece itself. Actually, three reasons. First, it allows for better detail fidelity on the part. Second, it allows you more surfaces to paint, so if you want to make the housing a slightly different color from the periscope insert, which was something that was very commonly seen, this allows you to do so and do so more easily as opposed to trying to carefully paint around there with a paintbrush. And the third reason, believe it or not, is a homage to the Panzerwerk ones, which were the same way. The Panzerwerk units had the prism integrally molded, because they were resin, onto the housing like this, and then you would slip it in. So as an homage to my good dear friend at Panzerwerk, I went ahead and basically carried the flag over to the new generation part. So back to the part that we have over here. So the piece itself is not just intended to be static, but can actually have some functionality to it. The piece itself, of course, is designed to work with the ECA 3D printed periscopes like I have here, with both versions, the all-encompassing version or the super set, which is, again, this piece here, but with a separate brush guard that's made out of a printed metal material. Well, the piece is designed to actually plug into this unit over here. Now, right now, it's a little tricky to do so because with the way, again, this translucent material is, the stem is not exactly symmetrical. It's slightly oblong, not by much, but just slightly. And by the way, it's only the stem here. The remaining important bits are perfectly fine. So just a little bit of hand fitting is just going to be required in order to go ahead and get the piece to plug into the proper receptacle. When I was designing this in CAD, I actually literally used the CAD file and I took the measurements to make sure that the piece does fit. But again, with the way the tolerances are on actual manufacture, sometimes things change slightly, but that's just manufacturing for you. Anyway, on the pieces over here, they are designed to plug on, and because of that, once the piece is fitted in place and it's connected to it, you can actually pivot the unit as one unison part, which again gives the model some more accuracy, as well as a nice little added function, which is one of those features are commonly overlooked. I've done this pivoting function on many of my radio-controlled Sherman tanks, and that's done with the servo, but however, I never got a chance to actually do one with the internal periscope. So this is a first time and a first thing for ECA. So that's, and we'll see what that looks like as the video continues. So that's all there is for the periscopes, for the hatches, and this brings us to circling back to the Commander's Cupola. So the Commander's Cupola for the longest time has the hatch and has the drum section for an internal periscope. However, I never made a periscope for it, which again seems like an omission, but again, at the time the logic was, well, buy the Panzerwerk set, and then you can modify it to work with the ECA hatch, and that's what I did for the longest time, and that's basically how it went. And to do that back in the day, you'd buy the Panzerwerk one, and you would have to cut away all of this detailing over here in order to fit this onto the molded in drum. Well, on my new generation one, I went ahead and already did that for you. So you can see that the piece is right here, and it's designed from the get-go to mount onto the ECA Commander's Cupola. It's literally the exact same CAD file for the housing. The only difference is that it doesn't have the round disc. Other than that, it still fits on the periscope in the exact same way as we saw before. And there we have it. Again, we're going to see what this looks like fit in place as the video progresses. With the turret prep work out of the way, it's now time to start adding on the last of the parts, which brings us conveniently back to the Commander's Cupola. In the previous video, I went into depth on the cupola itself as well as the details and features that it has. However, since that video was recorded, the unit is now fully completed with its interior paintwork now out of the way. Flipping over the Commander's Cupola, you really get to now appreciate the inner periscope detailing just a little bit more as opposed to trying to see it from the outside. The panoramic cupola does have the paintwork done in the following format. So the first thing I want to mention is the interior section is all painted in flat white, while the inner portion of the hatch here is painted in olive drab, and we'll be circling back to that in a moment because it's actually quite important. But back to the detailing that we have here. So with the way the panoramic cupola is, we have these large lens inserts that get slipped into these sections over here on the real unit, and then a retention plate is fastened via these 3 hex bolts, and it keeps everything in place. On the cast rested unit over here, all this detailing is integrally molded in, and so the only thing you have to do is paint it. The paintwork is done with a little bit of gloss black on the inner oval section over here, which simulates the prism, and then just some flat black applied to the outer portion over here, which simulates the locking block. As for the material, or I should say the color, I've seen several variations out there, from flat black to even just in the white. Granted, the in the white one was a vehicle that was going through restoration, so if I was to take a guess, I'm pretty sure that that was just something that they were figuring out, and then the units would be painted in the following format. That's really all there is to mention about the internal periscopes. This is what it looks like from the outside portion of the vehicle, so when you open up the hatch and you peek around, this is the extent of the detailing that you will, or that will be visible. The next thing, of course, brings us to the inner hatch portion. This is where things get really interesting. So on the hatch itself, we have this very ornate ring that we have here, and the reason for this ring is this is a unit that has some measurements on it, and the idea is to give you a orientation on where the piece is. And why that's relevant is because on the late production Commander's Cupola, the entire round section over here can actually freely rotate 360 degrees. This is in contrast to the older split ring Commander's Cupola, where the entire unit was able to rotate. On the late production unit, that was not the case. The late production unit was fastened to the vehicle via these fasteners that we have here. The unit does give you some pretty good panoramic view. However, if you really want to make sure there's no blind spots, the entire top portion here, again, had the ability to freely rotate. And that is done with this little knob over here. You basically pull this, and this unlocks the piece, and you could rotate this thing around, and you get to use the periscope that, again, I'll be circling back to in a moment. Because of this, we have this little indicator point right over here, and on this ring, on the real unit, it would have measurements pressed in, and then you could quickly take a glance on exactly where the orientation of the periscope is in proportion to the vehicle. And this is something that's very important. It's very easy to lose orientation when you're all buttoned up on the inside and a bunch of stuff is hitting the fan. On the real ring itself, it's actually made out of a brass ring, and then the piece would have would be painted, and the brass sections would be, or the graduations would be exposed in the natural color. I have seen this in the opposite way on some vehicles where the ring is just left in brass, and then the measurements are painted with black, or there's black rubbed in on the inserts. Either way will work. Me personally, I think it just looks a bit sharper in this type of format, but again, I have built models in the past with the ring rendered in the other format. So either way will work. It just boils down to personal choice. But if I was to take a guess, I think this one is actually the way it would leave the factory. And the other way is, again, just something that we see on restored vehicles. From the graduated ring brings to the periscope mount. This here is the same unit that I mentioned before, but now you finally get to see it fitted in place in its final format. And if I may say, it finally completes the ECA cupola. For the longest period of time, as I mentioned in this video and even in the other video, this one component eluded me for many, many years because, again, I just opted for the Panzerwerk one. But even though I always felt as if the Commander's Cupola set was incomplete, it was a practice in expediency just rolling with the Panzerwerk one. And also with Path of Least Resistance. But finally now, the set's complete all these years later. And the piece really takes to it very well like a duck to water. As for mounting the component in place, this is done with just adhesives. You could just glue it right on. However, for extra added strength, I went ahead and drilled the middle portion out of the mount and also a corresponding hole in the cupola, and then this facilitates a metal pin to be secured in place. With the adhesives, it makes it much more stronger and robust. Why this is important is, well, when the hatch is closed, it's going to spend most of its time in this format. Well, gravity being what it is always pulling on the piece, and after a while the glues can get old and the piece can potentially pop off. This is compounded with the action of the hatch opening and closing. Just that little shudder and vibration of the hatch going clunk can potentially weaken the glue bonds as well. However, with the pin in place, much more robust, and you don't have to worry about that happening. For the piece itself, this is where I ran into actually a bit of tricky trying to track down some references, is paintwork. The color of the actual periscope itself. The reason why I say this is that I've seen it rendered in about 3 different ways. On older builds in the past, I went ahead and utilized a light gray for this bit of equipment over here, but I've also seen it rendered in just standard flat white, olive drab, and for this vehicle here, I went with the piece being left in its natural metal color. I have seen pictures of all 3 examples, so your guess is honestly as good as mine at this point. But again, for this one here, I wanted to roll within this format because not only did I see it on several examples, but also it kind of looks pretty cool and sharp to have it in this format. For the paintwork, this was all done with the paintbrush with some silver paint. I went ahead and just carefully applied it to the appropriate locations. And then once it was done, I weathered it and secured it in place. The only thing to mention is the headrest over here. This is a soft, it's not really a foam, but it's a padding of some sort or another. I went ahead and painted this with Tamiya Khaki Drab for the color. It does a good job replicating that. And also the mount itself, you'll notice, is painted just with flat black. The padded mount is a standalone part that gets fastened in place as one unit. So having this represented with a different color here is definitely something that gives the piece just a little bit more extra color pop, but it's also something that would be true to form on the real unit as well. The other thing to mention about the cupola, in case I didn't mention it before, are these 2 little tabs over here. These are locking tabs and are used to secure, I believe, the periscope in place. This is a removable part, and it's not uncommon to see these units with the entire periscope insert here not present. When that's the case, there is a plate that goes into this section over here, fits in place, and it makes for a lower profile. You don't have this bit of equipment dangling down. However, I always did like the look of the periscope fitted in place. It just completes the look of the piece, in my opinion. And again, on the real unit, this piece would rotate, and the commander would actually be able to see a little bit more. And this now circles us back to paintwork. And again, this is something that's very important because this is actually a very commonly asked question that I personally receive, and it's also a commonly asked question on the communities, be it Facebook or any of the number of forums, and it's one that most people seem to give the right answer for, but there's always that one guy that is completely off base. It happens every single time. When it comes for painting a hatch or a commander's cupola, regardless of the country of origin, be it from the US, Britain, Russia, or Germany, and also regardless of time period, be it from World War II all the way up to the present day, the rule of thumb is still the same, and that is the internal portion of the hatch is almost always the same color of the outer portion of the vehicle. And on a cupola, the inner portion of the commander's cupola is painted with the same color of the inner portion of the vehicle. Back to the color choice on this example here, you'll notice that for the internal sections of the cupola, I painted them in white, and this was again used on all US World War II tanks of the period. World War II US tanks, the interior were painted in white, and this was true to form up until probably the 1970s and the 80s or so, where you've seen a lot of other vehicles such as armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored cars switch over from the white to the seafoam green. However, tanks in particular, be it from the M60 to the Abrams, utilize white for their interior color. But again, for the hatch is not painted with the interior color. The hatch is always painted, or 99.9% of the time painted, with the same color as the remainder of the vehicle. The reason why this is the thing has to do for camouflage reasons. If the vehicle is opened up like this and a plane is flying overhead, a hatch that's painted white is going to stick out like a sore thumb, and it's going to give away the vehicle's position and potentially opening up from getting attacked. However, if the hatch is the color of the remainder of the vehicle, it's going to blend in a lot better in comparison to the thing being all white or even seafoam green for that matter. Without fail, there's always that one guy that does a build and he spray paints or paints the interior portion of the hatch white. That is definitely something that will hurt the look of the build. And I can already see people in the comment section saying, but John, I've seen this vehicle with a white interior hatch, or the picture of this vehicle with a white interior hatch. And almost always, those vehicles are in a museum or in a private collection or were restored, and in those circumstances, the interior portion of the hatch is painted incorrectly during the resto process. So don't fall for that. It's something that you have to watch out for when you go ahead and use restored or museum vehicles for reference. A lot of times, those vehicles that are surviving examples or in museums have certain things on them that were either added post World War II, sometime during the vehicle's later service life, or they're just things that were painted or done during a restoration process and are incorrect. It may sound blasphemous to say, but that is definitely something to watch out for. Well, the hatches are definitely one of them. Now, there are a few photos out there from World War II of in-action vehicles of the hatch painted white. That most certainly is a field modification. Some dude the vehicle more likely had the interior repainted for one reason or another. Either it was hit and they cleaned it up, or the patch was just in bad condition from just wear and tear, and they decided to just clean up by throwing on some paint, and the only thing they had was some white. That, again, is an outlier. It is an exception to the rule. For that one example, there is about 1,000 more where that's not the case. So unless you're rendering that particular vehicle, you don't want to do that. Don't be that guy. So when you're painting your model, regardless of scale, or even if you're doing a resto on a real one, be sure to paint the hatch the right color. In this case here, it's the same color of the remainder of the vehicle. I hope you enjoyed my TED Talk. And with that in mind, so the color that you see here is, again, the same exact color that I painted the remainder of the vehicle, and the weathering is also what the rest of the vehicle is going to look like, once it catches up, of course, to the internal portion that we have here. This was all applied, again, with the airbrush, with the base coat, and then I went ahead and added the remainder of the weathering with the use of several types of airbrushing effects, and then a little bit of Tamiya panel line accent to get into the little seepage of the bearing areas, just to make everything really pop out. And the only thing that needs to be done now, well, is again the installation of the periscope prison. And as for what that looks like, which looks something like this. Here you can see the same units that were shown earlier, but now in their final format. These units have been assembled, painted, weathered, and at this point here are ready for installation. As usual, with the units fully completed like this, you really get to appreciate all that subtle design and detail work that I was mentioning before. With one of the units in hand, and hopefully the camera in focus, you get to see some of those details now in better light. The one thing I want to start with is the lens. Because the lens is made out of that translucent material, it has much more depth and added realism to it, as opposed to just painting the piece with a swipe of gloss black. I'm not sure you can see this, but hopefully you can see the inner portion here of the lens. You can see some of the interior section of the printing, and it just, again, gives it just for that nice little extra added touch. If I move the piece around, you get to see those lock mechanisms that I was referencing before, now painted, as well as those inset little details. The lock sections, and even the data plate right there, properly painted. It's a little extra work to do. You have to have your paintbrush game and your fine paintbrush work in order, but if you go ahead and take a little bit of extra time, it's definitely going to look cool. You don't have to do it. Once it gets slid in place, you're probably not going to see that much of it, but at least you get to appreciate it right now in the following scene. We also have that little spring section over here, painted in silver, again, just like the real ones. On the main base here, this is Tamiya olive drab acrylic that was airbrushed on, but before I do that, the entire unit is thoroughly covered in a coat of flat black primer. The primer is needed just to, again, get a nice surface for the paint to stick to. Before I go ahead and apply the paint, however, of course, the lens here is masked up with a little bit of masking tape. Carefully just trimmed with a small little X-Acto, and then the extras peeled off, leaving for a nice little mask in this section. Once the piece is masked off, it's then time to add the paint. The paint was again applied via the airbrush, so it's nice and even. And then once the paint dried, I went ahead and painted the lens cover over here on the interior portion with Tamiya flat black. Again, applied via the airbrush. The piece here is a sleeve and basically slips over the prism over here and it's fastened in place with some fasteners. Again, all these details are integrally molded on, look at me, printed on. Seriously guys, old habits really do die hard. Outside of that, the unit was then just carefully painted again with the silver bits here. This was done with a paintbrush, as was the data plate there where I first painted it with the black and then with a little bit of gold to achieve the effects that you see here. For the weathering work, this was just done with some Tamiya panel line accent. I just went in there with the brush, applied it to the certain locations, and it gives the piece the final look that we have here. It was done, of course, to all three of these units. However, you'll notice that there's one little variation. This one here, the little tab is painted in black. Again, I've seen this on a real example. I've seen them in black, and I've seen them in the white. So again, you are open to some artistic license. One other thing I want to mention is with these little handles that we have up here, one of the units wasn't properly printed, so rather than just not using it or waiting to print another one or some other thing along those lines, I went ahead and just simply fabricated a new one. I just took some soda can aluminum, bent it to the same shape, cut the old one off, and just glued the new one over it. It's a very simple repair that was done. This is definitely not going to be on the production units. The production units will be perfect. I may go ahead and design this as a separate HD 3D printed part, so you could just drop that on in case the misprint section over here becomes a recurring issue, but that's something that's neither here nor there. Or I should say remains to be seen. Either way, with the piece fitted, it blends in absolutely perfectly with the other units, and you can't tell which one is which. In fact, I don't think this was the one. I think it might have been one of the others. But either way, it fools me. It's definitely going to fool everyone else. So nothing much to go over here. For the unit for the cupola, I'm going to roll with this one here with the black tab, while these two here are going to be saved the front bow hatches. As for securing this guy in place, as I showed before, you just slide him in. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention about the lens is that in order to get the lens to be a little bit more clear and crisper, with Tamiya Gloss Clear Acrylic, I just applied a swipe of it with the paintbrush, and this has the effect of making the lens look smoother and also makes it look much more transparent as opposed to the raw material. It's a simple procedure. I've mentioned this in a few other videos in the past, and it does the job quite nicely. For installation, I'm just going to slide this guy in place. However, before I do, I went ahead and drilled a small little hole in the middle portion over here just to have clearance for that little pin that I mentioned before. For drilling the pin out, you don't want to drill all the way through the commander's cupola. That would be bad. But fortunately, as you can see, there's quite a large section of meat over here, so you have ample amount of material to drill into and not go all the way through. But it's still one to watch out for either way. Now that I have all the resin powder out of the way, I can just drop this felt in place. You don't have to glue them. They can just be held on with friction. And that's it. I'm just going to go ahead and slide him in. And once the unit's slid in place, the installation is complete. Now on the real unit, in order to keep this guy in place, this little tab over here would be pushed in, and then this would lock or seal off this section over here and thus prevent the piece from backing out. But that's not the case on this one. It's not functional. I know, again, I'm a slacker, but either way, you get to see and what it looks like now with the periscope added, and it really completes the look of the part. Currently, the periscope is not in all the way. As you notice, there's no external periscope here on the cupola, so it's in the half-installed format. On the real unit, you would push it in all the way, and then this would pop open on the outside, or on the reverse side. But either way, you now have the internal detailing present on the commander's cupola. From here, this thing is actually ready for installation, so no point messing around with that. I could set him aside, though, and shift my efforts on the remaining bow hatches, which will look something like this. And just like with the commander's cupola, once the periscopes are added, the hatches are fully completed. Here you get to see what the completed sets look like on the exterior. I also went ahead and painted and weathered the interior sections, which we'll get to in a moment. As I mentioned several videos ago, these hatches here are the cast resin dragon drop-in hatches that are found on the ECA catalog. They've been available for some time and will continue to stay in production for the foreseeable future. However, this is the first time I got a chance to use one on one of my own builds, and I also went ahead and finally wrapped up the details that otherwise I used to have to add as aftermarket, namely the outer and inner periscopes. Obviously, I already mentioned the inner periscopes in great depth in this video, and we'll be going back to that as the video goes on, but here you get to see what it looks like with the outer periscope fitted as well. I'll go ahead and use this one over here because it's painted identically, and also this one is a little bit looser mounted to the inner unit. We'll go circle back to that in a moment. But anyway, so here goes the completed outer portion. This set here I went over in greater depth in the previous video. The units are 3D printed in a translucent material. They are a single piece printing, so you have everything integrally on the piece, from the brush guard to the cover cap to the lens to the base plate. All that is, there's no assembly required in that regard. And really, it's nothing more than an exercise in paintwork. So to paint this, I went ahead and you have to first mask up the lens section here. Fortunately, with the width of the periscope itself, it's the exact same width of a standard thin section of masking tape that I found in hardware stores, so it's very advantageous in that regard. Once the piece is masked off, then the entire thing is primed with some flat black. The spray paint goes on after that's dry, and then go ahead and go through the motions of painting, like I mentioned earlier in the video. Same base coat color that was referenced before, same weathering with the airbrush, a little bit of Tamiya panel line accent later, and the green work is all done. Where this piece is different, though, is with the lens section. So on the M6 periscopes, the portion that would emerge from the tank is actually black in color, and some units also have a green faceplate found on the front, but this one here is modeled with the faceplate absent. That's why we have 2 rows of fasteners that are found. The fasteners are just left in their natural steel color on the real unit, so a little dab of silver paint was used to highlight them to the way you see it here. For the black sections, this was done with Tamiya flat black with a paintbrush. You have to carefully go in there and make sure everything is properly painted. Once that's done, you're good to go. Once the paint and weathering work is all done, I go ahead and peel off the masking tape, revealing the translucent resin material left intact. However, in order to get a little bit of extra sheen on it, I use the same technique that I mentioned before with the Tamiya clear gloss for the same reason. And once it's added, you can see just how much better the piece looks overall compared to just rendering it with the, or just leaving it with the natural material exposed. And nothing much more needs to be said about that, which brings us directly to the interior portions of the hatch. If I go ahead and flip this guy over, boom, there you go. Now you get to see what the internal detailing looks like, fully painted, weathered, with the periscope added in place. As I referenced several times, the unit is designed on this model to be pivoting. Doesn't take really any extra work to do so, and it's one that gives a lot of extra added realism and functionality to the model. If I go ahead and pop this guy off, you get to see what the completed unit looks like, with the periscope insert and all. One thing I do want to mention is that on the bottom here, I had to make some slight modifications. First, with these 2 cutouts, the reason why I added these was on this example, or I should say on the first batch of examples here that I have had printed, there's a small little shelf for some reason that's sticking out from these 2 sections, and this was inhibiting the periscope on being seated fully, which was causing a bit of an issue. So in order to take care of it, I had to cut out the bottom portions here and remove it from the inside. This was done because with the location, it's easier to get to from the bottom as opposed to trying to get to from the top. And since this is butt up against the hatch anyway, it's not noticeable or remotely visible, so it's not an issue. However, this is something I am going to revise, and on the production units, that will not be the case. Another thing that I had to do was drill a hole in the center portion here of the periscope insert because of the stem here on the outer portion. This needs to be done so that the piece can actually plug in a nice snug manner. As you see before, I was able to pivot this thing quite easily. On this one over here, it's a mirror image, of course. However, with the way the hole came out on this one, or with the way the stem was was hand fitted on this one. It's slightly loose, so displaying it right now, it's just going to fall off. However, obviously, once the glues get added, the piece will be nice and firm, and that's not going to be an issue. As for the units, these are not going to be installed yet at this time. This is because the hatches are going to be mounted permanently to the tank, and then the tank needs to go through the rest of the paintwork. So this is something that's best done after the weathering is all done. At the very tail end of the build, I just go ahead and plop these guys in place, install them permanently, and then I'm all set. Of course, I'm going to add a little bit of masking tape on this section over here just to prevent any sort of overpaint or overspray getting on the inside. But as you can see, the internal portions of the hatches look fantastic, and they look even better with the periscope detailing fitted in place. Of course, once the hatches are all set, they are now mounted in place on the hull. For fitting the hatches, this is just done with a securing pin. Once that's done, the hatches are now one with the rest of the vehicle. As I mentioned before, of course, the periscopes are still removable, and they will be mounted permanently at a later date. However, at this point, you really get to see exactly how much more complete this area looks with the hatches now in their final form. Prior to the installation of the hatches, of course, the bow section was thoroughly primed, painted with the base, and I also went ahead and took care of the airbrushing for the weathering and some of the dry brush weathering that's going to be, again, found on the remainder of the vehicle. This is best done now because the hatches are removed and you just get a little bit better access as opposed to when the hatches are fitted in place. It can still be done, but it's just a little bit easier before these units are permanently mounted. And here's the turret with the commander's cupola and the loader's hatch now fitted in place in a permanent manner. They're just mounted on with some drops of adhesives, super glue specifically, and once the glue's set, they're good to go. For the loader's hatch, in addition to the adhesives that were used to help mount this thing in place, I also went ahead and tooled up this little piece that we have here on the lathe. This here is just made from some resin, and this one here is going to be utilized for the rotating periscope that was mentioned in the previous video, but I don't think I mentioned that in the other video that I tooled up a second one in order to mount onto the descending peg found on the loader's hatch hinge. With the way the piece is designed, there's this peg that descends down from the hinge, so you got to plug it onto the turret. Well, the piece does protrude from the inner portion, and to give the piece just that much more structure, this little piece was designed. So more than, again, a little disc or a spacer that I spun on the lathe, and then once the piece was fit in place with the glues, it helps bind everything together, giving much more surface area, making the hatch installation, again, much more robust. However, you get to see how the piece just opens and closes absolutely flawlessly. And there's nothing much more needs to be said about that. The only bit of equipment that, again, still needs to be designed, and I'm waiting for it to come in from the printer, is the hatch retaining latch that's found in this section over here. That's something that is the last bit of equipment that's going to need to be added to the model or to get this thing actually into paint. But more information on that is to come in the next video. For the commander's cupola, again, just drops into the appropriate locations. A bunch of super glue later. The piece was seated in place. You want to make sure that the cupola is at the proper orientation. Again, I mentioned in the previous video that how the piece would mount, and now you get to see what it looks like fitted in its correct area, or its correct location, I should say. When you're installing hatches like this, you want to make sure that when the glues are setting, you leave the hatch in the open position, specifically with super glue, because super glue does have a habit on creating that gas white stuff, and if the hatch is open, it has a chance, if there's any gas in there, to vent outward and prevent any sort of ugly residue that can really hurt the look of the piece. The loader's hatch, this was also done in the same type of manner. But sometimes you want to have the hatch closed because you want the piece to index properly with the closed area. So again, it just depends on the situation. For the loader's hatch, I went ahead and mounted in the closed position just until the glues were biting enough where I could go ahead and safely open the hatch up to let the piece set further. And that's exactly what was done. And as you can see, the end results speak for themselves. The installation was a complete success without any sort of collateral damage from any sort of CA gas. With the hatches out of the way, one of the last bits of detailing that will be added to the model at this time are the various casting and foundry marks that litter the sides and the various bits of equipment found on these vehicles. This is frankly a bit overdue. Generally, when I'm applying these details, I'm doing it as the build is going on. But either way, there's a reason why I went ahead and waited this long, and also it shouldn't cause any problems in the grand scheme of things. On American military vehicles, the casting and foundry marks are a very important bit of detailing because first, it identifies what every part is, which is just staggering to think of, but also it gives such added accuracy and realism to the piece that once everything's painted and weathered, it just really makes it look that much more polished as opposed to leaving it absent. In fact, one of the hallmarks on ECA parts that really made them stand out when I was producing them and releasing them at first was that all my parts had casting and foundry marks on them, and it just really kicked the level of the build up several notches. However, in the past, adding the foundry marks was always a bit troublesome and problematic. Not necessarily because it's time consuming, you have to manually lead and kern every little letter and number. That was actually the part that wasn't too bad. The real problem was sourcing the amount of numbers and letters in order to do the job. In the past, I used to utilize the sets here from Plastruck. They come in several different sizes, and as you can see, you have a full alphabet and a bunch of numbers from 1 to 0 in order to fulfill your needs. Unfortunately with these sets is that for the price that they charge, you don't have enough to do really one vehicle, and you need several different sets and different sizes. And the part that was always problematic was they give you barely enough numbers, and they give you plenty of letters, and most of the letters are really not necessary or used for a tank build. The numbers you burn through extremely fast, like this one over here. You see it's almost completely depleted, and it's not uncommon where you're going to need about 3 or 4 of these sets just to outfit just maybe a turret or even some portions of the hull. And as good as those sets were for the longest period of time, I always felt that they could be better. And also one other thing to mention is that these are just letters and numbers, and what they don't give you are the actual foundry marks. The actual foundries that produce these parts, there were plenty, a litany of them that were making these parts during World War II, and each one of these foundries had their own little insignia or cage code that they would go ahead and build into the castings. And you're just not going to get those with these sets over here. So fast forward to today, I now went ahead and did the work, and we now have listed on the ECA catalog a complete set of foundry and cast marks. This is actually the new set. I recently released a set of foundry marks for the General Steel insignia, which I always refer to as the Super G. That was something I mentioned in a number of videos ago for a new product announcement, but for this particular build here, we have these components that are present. These sets here are optimized for use with building 1/6 scale US military vehicles. This is in contrast to the old Plastruck sets where you have just a skeleton crew of numbers and a plethora of letters that aren't really useful for your build. On the ECA set here, it's the opposite. We have here numbers, letters, and foundry marks for these vehicles, and they are rendered in several different sizes. And each set comes with a set of all 3 sizes to work with. This is important because depending on the part on the vehicle that you're trying to put marks on, sometimes the numbers are smaller, sometimes they're bigger, and sometimes they're in the middle. And with this guy over here, I have you covered with all 3 in all different sizes. So this is definitely something that is going to be a great benefit for use out there on anyone who wants to spice up their vehicle. The components are resin 3D print, and we'll see what they look like in more depth once I go ahead and take them out of the packaging. But also, the prices on these components are much more competitive compared to just buying a bunch of the Plastruck units. So again, I feel your pain out there. I know what it's like to work on these things, and now I'm happy to announce that we have a set here that's custom tailored basically for your needs. Here's the set removed from the bag. During extraction, 1 or 2 of the numbers and letters popped off. However, obviously they are just in the bag and are supplied with the pieces. Starting with the numbers, we have 2 sizes of numbers. We have here the larger size and the smaller size. These 2 were the most common size units that I used on my own builds, so I went ahead and just replicated the same scale for the 3D printed sets. As you can see, you have a full number spread from 1 to 0, and it's repeated several times. And here you can see the larger numbers that we have right here. And again, everything is just in duplicates. In addition to the numbers, we also have the prefixes that are found before the serial numbers, be it the abbreviation for the word serial, or serial number I should say, SER. We have LO, OSF, as well as the all-important letter D. Every single serial number on these vehicles have a D prefix, and then before the D prefix, we would have, on many occasions, the Foundry. LO is one, OSF is a very common one, and then we have here the various other foundries that produce these vehicles. I don't know offhand the name of the foundry, but I'm pretty sure I'll go ahead and throw that into the bottom portion over here when I go through this in editing. But we have here the H in the partial circle. We have a 7 in a partial circle, and we have the E in a partial circle. And all of these sets have been reproduced several times in several different sizes. Same is also true again for the term serial number, as well as the D and the other mentioned cast or foundry marks I stated before. With one of these sets here, you have more than enough to outfit one tank, unless you are really, really, really having bad luck and you're breaking everything or losing everything. You have plenty enough on here to outfit one tank, and you could probably play your cards right, maybe squeeze 2 or 3 out of one ECA set. Also, again, the price is going to be much more affordable compared to trying to do the same thing with the Plastruck letters. I can already see some people asking, yes, Jumbo, what about the SS Foundry or the other Foundry or this other Foundry? This is something that's definitely a option I'm looking into, and I definitely see these sets being expanded as time goes on with the other various foundries that produce the parts for these vehicles, and again, in the same sizes, no less. If there is a certain foundry that you do want to go ahead and see me add to the sets over here, go ahead and reach out to me via the email address info@eastcoastarmory.com, and I will see what I could do on tooling up a set for you. Or not just for you, but it'll be listed on the general catalog. As I mentioned before, I already have the General Steel Super G logos. That has been on the catalog now for a little bit of time, and it's a nice piece to accompany it with the set that we have here. Anyway, enough of that jibber jabber. Now I'm going to go ahead, snip these things off, and start adding them to the vehicle, which is going to be the fun part. And after a bunch of leading and kerning, I was able to get the cast and foundry marks fitted to the model. First place I'm going to start with is the unit right over here next to the driver's hatch. The setup that we have here is literally taken directly off of the real M4A3 that I did the walk around on. I may have changed a number or two on the serial number just because I wasn't rendering that particular vehicle, but the format that you see here was lifted directly from that example. With the turret removed, you get to see the other place where I saw foundry marks on that vehicle, which was right over here, and that part was an OSF cast component. The serial number is identical. It's not really a serial number, that is actually a casting number for the component in question. On the opposite side here, I also went ahead and lifted off the, I believe that was the serial number for that one, if memory serves. The very last place we have cast marks on the hull is right here on the bottom portion of the transmission cover. Here you can see the foundry mark, the cage number, as well as the serial number right there on the top. This number right here, or these series of numbers, I was able to see off of a real Sherman Jumbo. There was a good photograph online of one, and the only thing I did change was the 254 serial number. The other one was 255 or something similar to that, and again, I just wanted to make it just slightly different from that example. But the number 7 in the half circle, the actual cage number, is identical to the other example. On the rear portion of the blower, you get to see the item number right there, along with the foundry as well. And the remainder of the marks on the turret are right over here. This would be the casting number for the jumbo turret. Again, this one here is a Union Steel version of the jumbo turret and not the OSF. The OSF one would have had OSF written right over here, as well as a little bit more of information from what I've seen from the surviving examples. The Union Steel turrets, however, have this type of format where here we have the catalog number, or the mold, or the pattern number, I should say. I think, yeah, pattern number is what we're going to roll with. Has the pattern number right over there, and then the actual serial number is actually found on the side portion here of the turret. For these turrets, the serial number I've seen in several locations, but they're generally located in this area over here, be it in the middle, on the lower portion of the cheek, and possibly sometimes in this area. But by and large, this is where we find the serial number for the turret in question. This one here, I made 168. The real unit I was using as reference was 165. And that's all there is to mention about the Foundry marks. And this brings us to the other periscope that we have right there. As we can see, since the last video, it's been painted and weathered. The unit still has its pivoting feature. However, right now, again, it's not fitted in place permanently because, like I said before with the bow hatches, this is going to be mounted permanently after the remainder of the paintwork and weathering work catches up to the periscope itself. And this brings us to the last thing that needs to be done to the turret in order to get them all into paint, and that is with the hatch retention latch that needs to be mounted right over there. Here you can see the loader's hatch once it opens up. Normally there would be a securing device right over here in terms of a latch. Fortunately, I do not have the latch on hand at this moment. I went ahead and designed it in CAD. It's in production. As soon as I have it in hand, go ahead, prime it, assemble it, and throw it onto the appropriate location. Once that's fit in place, the tank at that point there, modeling wise, is finished, and it's actually ready to slide off in the paint. So really, really exciting time for that. But that's something that is, of course, going to be the topic of another video for another day. Moving back to the front portion of the turret brings us to the gunner's optic. The unit has been temporarily fitted in place, and you get to see what it looks like in its final format. Right now, the top lid is just placed on without any sort of adhesives. I really don't want to break it, so there we go. More than likely, this will be super glued when the time does come, but there you can see the optic. This, of course, is also not yet permanently glued on. It's just placed there with friction, and I can just pop it off, but I'll do that off camera. Either way, you get to see what it looks like with the gunner's optic fitted in place. Just like with the other periscopes, it's painted the same manner because the lens is, or I should say the periscope insert, is the M6 scope, if I'm not mistaken. And it definitely has the exact same detailing on it compared to the other units. Needless to say, the addition of these components here is a huge step forward, and the tank is effectively ready for painting. There's still that one stupid little piece that I need to add, but outside of that, this one here, modeling-wise, is done, and basically the only thing I need is a nice, clear, sunny day in order to take this thing outdoors and get it in its final coat of paint. Which, unfortunately, for this time of the year, it's easier said than done. But luckily, we're coming out of the sphincter of the year soon, and once I have some nice, beautiful weather ahead, this thing here can just rocket sled to the finish point. And that is definitely something I'm going to look forward to, and what I'm going to, of course, take you all along during its completion. While I'm waiting for that last detail part to come in and for the weather conditions to improve, that doesn't mean I could just stop on the project cold turkey. There's one other thing that I need to do that's going to be an important bit of equipment in order to get this model finished, and that is the track. Yes, obviously you can't have a tank without tracks, can we? And the tracks are currently off-site right now. They're unassembled, and I'm going to be going through the assembly process in an upcoming video, so that's definitely something to watch out for. But, as I generally say in these videos, that is most certainly going to be a topic for another day. And with that, that is the perfect point to wrap up this project update video for my 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel. It's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or my other type of content being smaller scale model showcase videos when they get posted. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook, where I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, as well as photographs of the other larger and smaller scale builds that have been seen on the channel previously. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.